Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to our presenters who are in Israel now. I am Professor Guy Bernstein, and I'm a visiting professor here at Cardozo. I'll be moderating this event. And I would like to start by thanking everybody who has worked on this event, primarily Professor Suzanne Stone, who's put us all together. I would also like to thank Hui Yan, who's done a superb job organizing this, and the Floersheimer Center for Constitutional Democracy and the Israeli Supreme Project, which are co-sponsoring this event. So today we're going to be discussing the Israeli government reform proposal, which focuses on reforming the governance system and particularly the judicial system, and has encountered protests, huge protests that Israel has never ever seen before, opposing the reform and claiming that this will undermine or even destroy completely Israel's democracy. So our main goal here in this webinar is to discuss what is this reform, why is it happening now, and in what ways can it destabilize Israel's democracy and society? More specifically, among the topics we're going to discuss, we're going to talk about the central features of the reforms, what is likely to happen if the reform or some part of it is adopted, what are the concerns for democracy and the rule of law, what's the impact on different groups in Israel, what could happen if it passes? Would the Supreme Court intervene? Would there be more pressures to finally adopt an Israeli constitution? Is it possible for the factions to come to a consensus? What has been done about it so far? And what are the lessons that can be learned from the extraordinary civic engagement for many, many people in Israel, and specifically law professors? Some of them are here with us today. So with that, what I want to do is to turn to our speakers. Each will speak for about 20 minutes. I'll then ask them some questions, and it will turn to general question and answer from the audience. And if anybody in the audience wants to ask a question, please write it in chat, and I will be monitoring the questions, and I'll pose them to the speakers. And so I'll introduce each speaker as in turn. So I'll start with our first speaker, who is Professor Ronen Avraham. He's a law professor at Tel Aviv University. He came to Tel Aviv University from University of Texas. And before that, he was a professor at Northwestern. Professor Avraham is the author of the Dataset of State Law Reforms, which is an important research tool in the study of tort reform in the United States. Professor Avraham teaches torts, insurance, and economic analysis of private and public law. His primary research interests are in economic analysis of torts and healthcare law, and the intersection of liability reform and healthcare reform. In addition, he writes about contract theory and theories of justice. So, Professor Avraham, we're going to turn to you.
Hi, good evening from Israel, and thank you for inviting me. Let me start with a short video that I would like to share. Here.
Meanwhile, in Israel, around 160,000 people protested in the capital of Tel Aviv on Saturday in opposition to the Supreme Court override bill. Joined by smaller demonstrations nationwide, protesters are angry at Israel's far-right government's attempts to implement judicial reform. This would allow it to overrule Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority in parliament. The proposed reform would also allow the government to nominate judges and removes the court's ability to determine the government appointments unreasonable. Both clauses passed the early stages of the process last Wednesday and need to pass 2 more parliamentary votes in order to become law. Now, the protest marks the 8th week that people have gathered in increasing numbers to protest against the reform.
Okay, so that was, did you see the video? Did I share it correctly? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I was just writing you. We heard it, but we couldn't see it.
Oh, never mind. I'm sorry, I forgot to click something. Never mind. But that was, I just want to quickly show you again, just the first few seconds, so you can see the mass of people demonstrating. That was from the 8th week. That was from the 8th.
Meanwhile, in Israel, around 160,000 people protested in the capital of Tel Aviv on Saturday in opposition to the Supreme Court override.
Okay, so, and now we're celebrating the 16th week, so that was 8 weeks ago, and the numbers have doubled, basically. Now we have demonstrations in the area of 200,000-300,000 people just here in Tel Aviv. If you want to put it in scale, just multiply by 30, so we're talking about maybe up to like something like 8-10 million people in the United States demonstrating in the same place. So what is this demonstration about? And now let me share my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just I have the light lifting here tonight. I'm just going to give you a survey of what is going on, and then Professor Lifshitz and Aronson will give you the more interesting and important stuff. But by and large, what we're talking about is reforming the judicial system in Israel. And let me give you some background about the judicial system in Israel. So we have it's a parliamentary democracy. We have unicameral parliament. Maybe not all of you know that there's one state in the United States that has just one house, and that is Nebraska, I believe. Otherwise, all other states, and of course the federal government, is a bicameral parliament. But we don't have an entrenched constitution. We have some basic laws similar to your neighbor in the north, Canada, but not as strong as the basic laws there. And in general, the democracy in Israel lacks many common checks and balances that you know from other democracies. For example, not only do we not have rigid constitution, we don't have two legislative houses, which is a way to distribute power down from the executive. In the United States, you have a presidential veto. There's a federalist structure. Even if the Supreme Court tracks down the constitutional right for abortion, you can still have states giving these rights back to their people. We don't have regional election and many other checks and balances that exist both in the United States and Europe. What also characterizes Israel is that the government controls the parliament. So unless it has the majority at any given moment, the majority of the parliament has to be part of the government, or at least have confidence in the government. Otherwise, the government falls. So unlike in the United States, where a president is elected for 4 years and nothing could remove it unless, it used to be a rare case of impeachment. Now we hear more about impeachments, but by and large, the president is elected for 4 years. In Israel, the government can fall a month after it was elected. And as we're going to see soon, that's actually what characterized the years before this reform. So our legal system is the only effective check on the government. Okay. So this is the parliament, this is the executive, the government, and this is the Supreme Court. And you would think that separation of powers means checks and balances, three branches that are equal to each other. But in Israel, what we have, as I just explained, is the government controls the parliament. So really, we start with a democratic deficit that instead of the 3 branches, we really have 2.5. And now what they're trying to do basically is to subordinate the Supreme Court or the judicial system in general also to the executive. And that will make us as democratic as Hungary or Poland. So some background about the new government. in 2019, the Prime Minister Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu was indicted on charges of breach of trust, bribery, and fraud. And that basically, many believe, has started the mess that we're now facing. We experienced a political crisis. We have 5 rounds of election in 3 years. So as I said before, once the government is elected, it's not guaranteed that it will rule for 4 years as it is supposed to. And indeed, we have 5 rounds of election in 3 years. So governments rose and fell within months. All that you need is a no confidence vote in the parliament or something similar to that. And on March 2021, there was what's called the Coalition for Change. And we had a government that was comprised of parties from the right, the center, and the left. And that was called the Bennett-Lapid government. Bennett was the first prime minister, then Lapid, after a year, replaced him, but he did not govern for a year because we had to go to another election. And indeed, in November 22, just recently, 6 months ago, Netanyahu came back and led the right-wing bloc and got to design his own extreme right-wing government. And indeed, it's the most right-wing government in the Israeli history. Also very religious, and not just religious, but fundamental religious. So there's a coalition there. There are ultra-Orthodox parties, which is not that unusual, but there's also an Orthodox party, which is purported to represent the Orthodox community in Israel, but actually it does not. It's comprised of extreme right-wing Orthodox Jews. Then, and that's really what started it all, in January 2023, the Justice Minister Yariv Levin unveiled a government plan for a constitutional overhaul of the judicial system. Now, it was a perfect storm because Justice Levin is an ideologist. He was planning on this overhaul for decades, maybe 2 decades. And then in every other part of the coalition, you can find people that have interest in overhauling the judicial system, starting with the prime minister, who allegedly is interested in controlling the judiciary, so that when he's now being tried for bribery in the court, and whatever happens there, it will reach the Supreme Court. So there's a claim that he's interested in overhauling the Supreme Court, so he can have more control over the justices that will sit in his case. That at least is the claim. Then you have the ultra-Orthodox that have been trying for decades to get a law that exempt them from military service, but the Supreme Court has blocked this on quality grounds. So they're interested in taking control over the judiciary so they can be exempt from military service, and so on and so forth. It's a coalition of each and every party has an interest in the executive taking control over the judiciary. So what are the major components of the proposed reform? And I'm starting from the top left. The most controversial issue is the Judicial Appointment Committee. It used to be a committee of 9 members. I will not go into details. I'm sure Shahal and or Ori will deal with it more, because now this is the hottest topic these days. But I'm just gonna say that it used to be a committee of 9 members with representation from the coalition, from the opposition, from the judiciary, and from the Israeli bar. And if you know a little bit about the way state Supreme Court justices, not the federal Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court justices are elected in the United States, this should not sound unusual to you, because it's similar to the system that many states in the United States have. And here what they're trying to do is to basically grant the coalition absolute control over the appointment of judges and justices to all courts. So it will be basically a subsidiary of the executive. Second is prohibiting judicial review of basic laws. So basic laws are like the Constitution, and that may sound logical to you. On what grounds can they judicially review basic laws? I mean, this is the Constitution. In the United States, the Supreme Court cannot review the Constitution. but anyway, that is something that is on the table. Another component is undermining judicial review of legislation. This is something that we have our own Marbury versus Madison from about 30 years ago, where the Supreme Court allegedly found in the air the power to judicial review cases. This is, of course, the way the government or the right wing puts it. There are other narratives for what really happened 30 years ago. But the point is that up until now, the Supreme Court could have struck down a law as being unconstitutional, that is being against or against the basic law. And it could do it in panels of 3, unlike at the federal Supreme Court in the United States, that sits always on bank 9 justices. In Israel, the most common panel is a panel of 3. There are 15 justices, but they sit in panels of 3, and sometimes larger panels of 5, 7, 9, and sometimes even 15. So the idea here is that if you want to strike down the law, it has to be on bank, 15 justices sitting here in the case, and then you need a supermajority, either unanimous vote, 15 out of 15, or supermajority 13. Now they're talking about 10. Anyway, that was the third component. The fourth component was what's called the override clause. You don't have it in the United States. Canada has something like that. The idea is that if the Supreme Court strikes down a statute as being unconstitutional, that is against basic law, then the parliament, imagine that the Congress could reenact that law and says, even though the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional, we're overriding, we're reenacting that statute, and now it has power. So that is impossible in the United States. It is possible in some circumstances in Canada, and they wanted to do it here so that the parliament, the coalition basically who controls the parliament, will be able to override a judicial determination of the law being unconstitutional. The fifth component is similar, but this time with respect to executive orders. So do they elude the judicial review of executive orders? And the last component is politicizing and weakening the Attorney General. Attorney General in Israel, it's also the Attorney General, but there are also legal counsel for all the secretaries or the ministers, and these are civil servants. They're not political appointees, and the idea is to make them political appointees. So if we look at all 6, if we look at all 6 components, what they have in common are a few things. First, while each one of them is debatable, I could actually maybe defend each and every single component of those 6 components of the reforms, but when you look at them together, they all point to one direction: more power to the executive. So one can be unhappy with the balance between the executive and the judiciary, but and maybe one might have a legitimate reason to maybe move more power to the executive at the expense of the judiciary. This is not my view, but I think it's a legitimate view. But I think it's illegitimate to try and do what they're trying to do here, which is basically to subordinate the judiciary to the executive by having all of these reforms simultaneously. So what they all have in common is that they all move power from the judiciary to the executive. Yeah, let's move to the next one. In addition to these 6 major components, so these 6 major components they're not the goal, they are the mean to achieving other goals. That is the coalition agenda, right-wing religious agenda. So what are they planning for us? Now we know more, but in the beginning we knew that they were interested in strengthening the hold of the politicians over the police, strengthening the hold of politicians over the military, shutting down the Public Broadcast Corporation, restricting the activities of civil society organizations. Now, actually, there are 150 bills that have been published, and so we know more about what they're planning. And many of them are not dangerous, but many of them are dangerous, and many of them would be struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional if this reform will succeed. And I think Ori or Shahar, Professor Aronson or Professor Lifshitz will talk about what they have in their pipeline for us. So I won't go into details here. What are the dangers of the governance plan more generally? And as I said before, unbridled power to the government, the executive. Remember, the executive controls the parliament, so we're basically talking about two branches, and now if they succeed, we're going to have one branch. We will have election. People say, oh, it's going to be dictatorship. I don't think it's going to become a dictatorship. I like to call it totalitarian democracy. We're going to have elections, but basically that's it. And even these elections could be easily distorted in a way that will fortify the right wing's control of Israel for many years. For example, it's enough that they say, oh, for the purity of the elections, we would like to have cameras inside the ballots to make sure that there is no fraud. This in and of itself will deter minorities from voting, and that will entrench their control maybe forever. No effective rights protection, minority rights, women, LGBTQ, Arabs. Arabs are the most vulnerable, is the most vulnerable group in Israel that will suffer if this reform passes. Then I think it's a close call between LGBTQ and women. And basically what we're talking about is a democratic backslide. If you guys know what happened in Hungary, in Poland, and another fear is like happened in Hungary and Poland is corruption. We've had the Supreme Court fighting corruption, for the past years. And if they are stripped away from their power to review executive orders, the fear is that we'll see a lot of corruption. Let me just remind you that our prime minister is now being tried for all sorts of corruption charges. So the most surprising and fascinating thing that happened is that the civil society fights back. And I started with the video of hundreds of thousands of Israelis rising up, refusing to give up on the democracy. Every Saturday night in 20, 30 cities around the country, there are demonstrations with speakers. In every such demonstration, there are 3 or 4 speakers almost every week in every town. There's a law professor speaking. All 3 of us have spoken in those demonstrations, and we try to explain to the public what I'm trying to explain to you, which are the dangers in this, in this legal coup, basically. And this has been effective. As I'm sure either Professor Lifshitz or Aronson will explain, there are now talks in the president's house. The president of Israel, unlike the president of the United States, is more symbolic. It's like the king in England. It's a symbolic figure. And now in the president's house, which is like the palace in England, the parties are negotiating a compromise. And this would have never happened but for the people rising up. It's the best time to be in Israel. And if you cannot be here and participate in the demonstrations yourself, make sure you follow up what's going on in this country, because you are seeing democracy in action. You are seeing people literally fighting, spending their time and money on protecting their freedoms and human rights. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Avraham, for this great review of what's going on. We will continue now with Professor Aronson. Ori Aronson is a professor at Bar-Ilan University, and he's the deputy director of the Manomadin Center for Jewish and Democratic Law. He served as a clerk and legal assistant to the Chief Justice of Israel, Supreme Court Aaron Barak, and as law clerk to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, Judge John Newman. His research concerns the institutional aspects of adjudication on the procedural system and constitutional levels. He has worked and published on the distribution of power among court units, judicial review in higher and lower courts, judicial discretion, and institutional analysis of diffuse legal and normative systems. So Professor Aronson, please join us.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you and good evening, good afternoon. Thanks for having me as well. Let me, I guess, maybe tag on to Onen's presentation with two quick points. One, also, I saw in the Q&A a question about the kind of principled arguments for the reform. So maybe I say a word about that and then go to additional tracks I had planned. One is just to mention a point about basic laws in Israel. So when I said, in other systems, it sounds odd that the court would review constitutional norms. The thing about basic laws in Israel is that they're passed in a normal, regular legislative process, meaning that if you basically make them immune from judicial review, any normal parliamentary majority can insert any kind of content into a basic law and in that way immune it from judicial review. And that was I guess that's the main concern there. And a question was posed in the Q&A about the I'd say the principled rather than the expedient arguments for the reform. I guess I can mention two main ones. One goes to kind of this general historic lack of constitutional agreement about fundamentals in Israel, and saying, since no one has agreed at any point about how the Israeli constitution should look, therefore no institution should be entitled to declare this system as a constitutional system, and kind of the default in that case should be just majority rule. I guess that's one kind of argument presented. Until we resolve our big constitutional questions, basic majority rule should not be superseded by any other principle. Obviously, that's a highly problematic point to make, but I think that's one argument that's presented. And the other is more about, say, the practicalities of government. There's this term in Hebrew, meshilut, I guess, governmentability, sort of saying, well, the court is such an active organ in Israeli governance. It overhangs over any policy question, and therefore that kind of limits the capacity of policymakers to sort of draw their effectuate their preferences, and people vote certain majorities into Knesset, into government, and then they just can't do what they want because they fear review by a non-elected court. So that's kind of a classic argument against judicial review in other systems as well, and it's been applied in Israel as well. And both these arguments sort of lead to kind of a default preference for majority rule, regardless of any other principle. I guess that's the best version I can give of the principled argument for the reform. I think it has not necessarily as persuasive as it might sound, but that's the way I understand at least the argument. So this is just to Zev's question in the Q&A. I was tasked with two main points or main issues to discuss. One is kind of more broadly the kinds of concerns that come out of this position, right? Basically, a preference for majority rule as a default for any policy question. Onen already alluded to some of these concerns. I'll say a bit more about that, and then going to his final point about this being kind of an exciting time in Israel. Some people calling it or terming it a constitutional moment, a point where maybe sort of fundamentals could be discussed, maybe even agreed. And I'll reflect briefly on that potential as well. So I'll start with the pessimistic aspects, right? The sort of concerning possible implications of the reform, and then go to sort of a more optimistic lane, saying, what could come out of this in a rosier future. So in terms of concerns, Oden mentioned a few kind of countries that now are kind of metonymic for constitutional decline, right? Hungary, Poland, these kinds of places. So we could draw different scenarios based kind of using these generalizations as frameworks of comparison. So one concern with these kinds of
we can't hear you. You're on mute, I think.
You cannot hear me?
I think you're mute.
I don't think I'm on mute, but
No, I can hear him.
Oh,
I can hear you.
So is it okay? Can I keep going? Yeah. Okay. So, Guy, I think this is something in your speaker, possibly. Okay, so I'm going to use a few countries that have been sort of, broadly documented in the literature of the past decade about democratic decline. to sort of draw several possible scenarios that will come out of this reform coming to fruition. Obviously, we don't exactly know how it will end, right? What I already mentioned, there's been some stoppage and we don't exactly know what will be passed, but given this general trend towards supremacy of majority rule as kind of the basic principle promoted by government, what can we imagine? So one scenario I would call it sort of the Hungary scenario, I already mentioned. In Hungary, what do we see? Basically, we see a government using very similar measures to the ones proposed by our governing coalition currently, basically for the relatively sort of immediate purpose of entrenching a governing coalition in power. So this is not a kind of significantly ideological project. It's more about kind of pure political power. Right? If we can shift the rules in a way that would let us remain in power, that's good for us. We can make money. We can prestige. We can enjoy kind of the bounties of ruling a country. And we see several sort of proposals being considered by the current government that if the reform passes would make them more possible, for example, changing or tweaking, say, election laws in Israel in a way that would make it harder for kind of a stable opposition to rise and gain a stable majority and overturn the political distribution of power in Israel. So one kind of a form of concern is about basically the entrenchment of a governing coalition in power, regardless of recurring elections. That's going to be the Hungarian scenario. A second kind of scenario, I don't know if it's better or worse, but it's I guess as concerning, I would call sort of the Venezuelan scenario, right? That's more about going to sort of the corruption point. That's what I mentioned, right? Taking measures such as, limiting the power of legal counsel within the executive and those kinds of ideas, right? Creating this concern that not only the government, kind of the big body up there, but also lower level administrative decision makers will be less bound by law, by legal norms, by administrative law, and therefore more susceptible to all kinds of corruption, right, of lower levels of governmental capacity, creating this concern that Israeli institutions will function less well in a way that will obviously erode its capacity sort of to be a functioning democracy and I'd say a thriving global market player, right, down the road. So that's kind of the Venezuelan scenario. A third one, probably the most concerning, I'd call perhaps the India scenario, right? Again, another country known for its process of democratic decline over the past decade, and there we don't see it's not only a matter of retaining power or diluting administrative capacities, but this is also a matter of ethnic, national, religious conflict, right, being taken over through constitutional, administrative, and governmental reforms, right? So we have majority groups, we have minority groups, and there's a deep-seated animosity between these groups. And these groups are also, to some extent, are also sort of structured into the political system in a way that, just enabling the majority to rule. Even given any principled argument you could present in any other context, when you have a society that's divided in this way, right? When you have majorities, minorities split along ethnic, cultural, religious, national lines, then this creates immense concerns, obviously, for abuse of the minorities' rights. And in Israel, we can see this obviously between Jews and Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, about 80%, 20%, but also in the sort of intra-Jewish identity dispute, right, between sort of a religious version of the Jewish state and a national or secular version of the Jewish state. These issues implicate rights of minorities intensely, LGBTQ, women. So the concerns there are also quite serious. I guess so we had Hungary, we had Venezuela, we had India, and perhaps the fourth country of concern we can imagine is Israel itself, right? So Israel today, I don't think is in as bad a shape in terms of its democracy as the three previous examples, but Israel today, in terms of constitutional stability, is certainly in a worse, or at least to my view, is in a worse place than it was, say, 5, 10, or 15 years, not because of the content of constitutional norms or of Supreme Court decisions, but just because in terms of the stability of our constitutional norms themselves. It's today, unlike say 10 or 15 years ago, constitutional norms are taken much more lightly. Small, one-sided coalition majorities in parliament allow themselves to change fundamental norms without seeking broad consensus. Constitutional amendments to basic laws, are used to take care of sort of expedient political issues that governments need to resolve. You know, there's this minister who has to be appointed, but there's a criminal issue, so we'll just fix something in the basic law and take care of that. And in that case, you know, even if the reform doesn't pass as a whole, and so we manage to retain reasonable independence for the judiciary, there is still the concern that what we saw today will sort of linger on, in the sense that constitutional norms themselves are perceived more and more as kind of amenable to expedient political change down the road. And this doesn't matter, you know, if you're a left-wing or a right-wing government. Once this is the fact, then constitutional norms are not as strong as they used to be, and obviously that's a risk if any government can just feel free to change the rules of the game in a way that would benefit its own political needs. So 4 kind of avenues of concern, right? Hungary, Venezuela, India, and then Israel also, which should be taken into account. My second, the second question sort of was posed was, so is there kind of an optimistic version here? And could we take this not kind of downhill as along sort of my Israel 23 version mentioned just now, but saying, you know, this is actually a point that will take us upward to a new direction. Is Israel kind of experiencing what the literature has called some form of a constitutional moment? Constitutional moments in other countries have been defined as kind of moments of social reality in which the levels of civic engagement in constitutional questions is unique or exceptional. People kind of think about these issues, care about them, and are actually willing to take action to change kind of structural realities in the life of the political community. And that's what I mentioned. This is really an amazing time here. It's both scary, but also exhilarating, right? You have hundreds of thousands of people day in, day out, active, doing this all the time. Us law professors, we haven't slept for several months, but it's not about us. It's about the fact that the population as a whole is part of this discussion. So we are experiencing kind of exceptional civic energy that I don't think we've ever seen in the history of the country. And that's kind of that's something that perhaps could be exploited for the best. However, I would not be optimistic of saying, you know, around the corner awaits the long, sort of delayed Israeli constitution. There are good reasons that Israel has not managed to arrive at a full established constitution over the past 75 years. As I already mentioned, we do not have fundamental agreement about the 2 big questions of Israeli constitutional identity, right? Jews, Arabs, an intra-Jewish, religious, secular, national census. We're not about to arrive at those agreements on that. We have the occupation to deal with. We have all these questions. This is not going to be resolved now. And therefore, I would be wary of saying, you know, let's finish this now, right, and arrive at our long-awaited constitution. It's noteworthy, and sort of, I think Ronen will agree that we have seen very little participation by Israeli Arab Palestinians in these protests. So this is not part of the discussion. Kind of we're finally arriving at some big resolution of our fundamental identity questions. However, it doesn't mean that we cannot do something, right, with what has happened. I guess Shachar will say more about kind of the negotiations going on that have gone on and have been handled in the auspices of the president. But I don't exactly know what's going on there. But sort of this idea that perhaps a few open questions could perhaps be now kind of resolved in a sense, at least entrenching some past practices that have been informal so far, and turning them into more stable constitutional norms in Israel. So that's a possibility that we could see happening. again, there's a lot of distrust in these discussions now. For example, the negotiations going on and the president's in Jerusalem, right, under the auspices of the president, are handled all the while as the coalition has kind of this credible threat of passing its legislation in parliament. It hasn't taken that away. So it's not certain that these negotiations can succeed. Where can we take this still? My suggestion would be kind of exploiting this unique or exceptional civic energy we've seen in Israel, actually to abandon law. We're all lawyers here in this group, but to go back to culture and to education. So many people are suddenly interested in questions about constitutional fundamentals, not only about kind of first order norms, do we support this group or the other, or that ideology or the other, but also how should we conduct ourselves as a political community. You start reading more and more kind of publications in the newspapers about the civics education in schools. When I'm not Zooming, already this week I give 2 lectures in apartments around the city, just people coming for an evening of discussion about constitutional issues, and they invite us professors, and we go voluntarily and just give these talks all throughout the country, and we see, I guess, two things. First of all, huge amounts of ignorance, so people don't know anything, but then it's sort of similarly huge amounts of interest in actually knowing, which is something very new. And I guess this is my most hopeful kind of reading of the situation now. I wouldn't expect sort of much salvation through law, at least in this round, sort of in the near future. But something about social cultural engagement can be kind of can be built upon from this point. And so hopefully us lawyers can also kind of remember that aspect of our job and not only kind of try to fix the drafts of bills being passed by Knesset. So I'll stop here and thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next panelist, who is Professor Shachar Lifshitz, who is a professor at Bar-Ilan University. He served as the Dean of the Faculty of Law and founded the Center for Jewish and Democratic Law. And he also, as a branch of the faculty, and jointly established the Israeli Congress for Judaism and Democracy as a project within the CJDL for creating national consensus. His fields of research include family law, contract law, Jewish inheritance law, multiculturalism, and human rights in Judaism. Professor Lifshitz was a senior fellow at the Israeli Democracy Institute, was a partner in the IDI's project for a constitution of consensus, and was the author of the Knesset bill Couples Covenant. Additionally, he has been a major partner in the IDI's project for human rights and Judaism. Professor Lifshitz has been a visiting professor at various law faculties, including at Columbia University, UPenn, University of Siena, YU, and Emory Atlanta. So, Professor Lifshitz, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. And I will begin by sharing with you my own personal experience with legal reforms. So even before the protest against the reform began in the official way, I was shocked by the proposals, and I spoke at a conference organized by former Minister of Justice of Israel, Gideon Sa'ar, to express my concerns from both a democratic and a Jewish point of view. And during my speech at that conference, I criticized, as I mentioned, the reform from both perspectives. From a liberal democratic standpoint, I discussed Rawls' veil of ignorance and explained that behind this veil of ignorance, individuals do not know if they will always hold power and therefore would choose an arrangement that moderates the power of the majority, and not as it was in the reforms that the majority say, we are now the majority, so we can take all the power for ourselves. From a Jewish perspective, I offer an interpretation to the frequently mentioned phrase in the Torah, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. זכור שעבדים היינו בארץ מצרים. In my interpretation, similar to the concept of the veil of ignorance, the Torah instructs us to treat the other side fairly, because in the case of the Jewish people, it is not just a hypothetical scenario where power dynamics can shift. The Jewish people were actually slaves and have the experience and the horrors of being treated unfairly. However, I later realized that protesting and resisting are important, but they are not enough. And there is a Hebrew phrase in Mishlei, say, Sur merah ve'aseh tov, which means don't only turn away from evil, but you have also to do good. So in my opinion, it is not enough only to protest against the reforms. We must offer a reasonable alternative that ensures Israel remains a liberal democracy while addressing the hardship and needs that led a large proportion of the public to support the reform, or at least the general idea behind them, even though not all the details. Therefore, I joined what sometimes called in the Israeli jargon the Dean's team, that was composed from around 10 legal scholars. 6 of them were previous dean in Haifa University, in Hebrew University, in Bar Ilan University, that formulate an alternative outlines for the reformers. And at the request of the president of the Israeli state, Herzog, we attempt to meet with various parties in Israeli public to help formulate principles for this alternative outline. Our approach was to try to responding to the legitimate claims of those who sought to change, as long as the amendment will be in a legitimate, liberal, democratic framework. We found that in many cases there is a broad common, let's call it the denominator of arrangements that will be deep within the complex of legitimate democratic principle and still provide an answer or respond to the legitimate claims of those who sought to change. I will demonstrate our methodology with 2 examples. First, the issue of judicial review of Chukei Yesod, the basic law, that forms the primary basis of the constitution in Israel, as both Ori and Ronen explained. Our proposed arrangement sought to provide an answer to both sides. On one hand, the claim of the reformers was that the constitution is written by the people. So if constitution is written by the people, then the court is not authorized to criticize the basic law themselves. So in our proposal, a court would not have the authority to substantively review a fundamental or basic law. But at the same time, we should preserve in the basic law fundamental rights that are currently missing in Israeli constitution. So it will be kind of package deal. We will add a right like equality, like freedom of speech, etc., etc. Also, we proposed a special procedure for adopting or amending basic law that requires the involvement of two sequence parliaments in a way that would prevent manipulative use of the basic law. In the event that there is an urgent need for an immediate change of fundamental law, a majority of 80 parliament members, 2/3 of the members of the Knesset will be required. A second example to the balance that we tried to achieve was a proposed mechanism for the whole issue of judges nomination. On one hand, we agree with Ori and Ronen analysis that in the context of Israel, it is not legitimate that the coalition could nominate a Supreme Court judge by itself without cooperate either with the opposition or with the Supreme Court judge. At the same time, when we meet with the reformators, we realize that there is justice in the claim that it cannot be that as a categorical issue in Israel as a de facto fact, never ever you cannot nominate Supreme Court judge if the current president of the Supreme Court objected. So I am not going to enter into the details, but we propose few mechanisms that enable on one hand to prevent the ability of the coalition to nominate Supreme Court judge by itself, and at the same time, we cancel the veto of the judges themselves about any possible future nomination in the Supreme Court judge. Unfortunately, our proposal were not accepted by the leader of the reforms in the previous round. We were not ready to compromise. While compromise is important, it is not always appropriate. And the improvement and agreement should be, as I mentioned, within a legitimate arena. Those who had to reject what the reformers themselves called as compromises that were offered by the coalition, but they didn't meet the minimum criteria for a legitimate compromise. The failure of the previous round led me in person to return to the protest and the demonstration. But I still hope that in the current round, there will be a better will to compromise. Our efforts have proven that there is a wide range of legitimate agreement building arrangements. The problem is not the possibility of compromise, but the lack of a real desire to reach it. I believe, or hope, or pray that such a desire will eventually be found. I assume that maybe you want to hear more about the specific details of the outline, maybe in the Q&A, but I would like to bring to your attention now a broader issue than the reforms themselves. Israeli society has lost the ability to build consensus in important issues that are under a dispute. Much like muscles that has not been exercised for a long time and has abolished or atrophied, instead we rely heavily on going to court and winning in debate, engaging in polarized discourse on social media, or resorting to boycott and threats. However, the method of building agreement is rarely employed, and it is methodology that requires thoughtful consideration. There are several skills that we lack, such as real acquaintance with one another, the ability to self-define and distinguish each camp between basic principles and things that we can compromise about them, empathy toward others, and the use of mediation and similar methodologies that are so common in other arenas of law and life and are missing in our public life. It is also essential to bring to the table not only the public petitors and organizations that represent extreme positions, but also organizations that find themselves less involved in court and politics, position like of what we call in Israel the Masortiim, the traditionalists, who are underrepresented in Israeli society, and their voice is very important. Those challenges are critical for Israeli society to address, both in the context of the legal reforms and, in my opinion, also in the day after. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lifshitz. So I want to pose a couple of questions, and then I will open it to the audience. If anybody has questions, you can put them in a question and answer, and I will read them out. So my first question, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating something already talked about, but I couldn't hear anything and I had to leave and come back. So if I'm repeating something that was said, please let me know. I'm interested in asking, there's huge opposition coming from women, from LGBTQ. I want to talk about a specific provision in the coalition agreement that has made these groups very, very concerned. And that's the provision that any owner of a private business will be able to refuse to let anybody in on basis of freedom of religion. Could you tell the audience about this and what's at stake here?
Who wants to go first?
You go.
Well, briefly, so obviously, you know this better than we do. This is direct influence from American practices and litigation on the rights of business owners to discriminate along sort of based on their religious beliefs. This has been quite foreign to kind of Israeli, I'd say, legal or constitutional discourse, these kinds of rights arguments. For various reasons, not the least being that Israel does not have a separation between church and state, and actually sort of religious practices and beliefs are deeply entrenched in other governmental structures. So they're usually not perceived as exemptions, but rather as kind of powers held by sort of majoritarian systems. So that's why it's kind of foreign to, say, Israeli constitutional discourse, but suddenly it's been introduced as part of already existing general anti-discrimination laws that we have that include very minimal exemptions for, say, shuls, right, synagogues, which you're allowed to separate between men and women, or those kinds of arrangements, trying to expand these exceptions into areas that have not been familiar in the sort of Israeli, again, both normative discourse, but also kind of legal means. We've seen these proposals mentioned in the coalition agreements that establish the government. Likud and the sort of the main party kind of came out against them. We know that the Speaker of the Knesset, a high-ranking member of Likud, is an outspoken LGBT rights activist. So there is some kind of friction within coalition about that, but obviously, if the sort of central elements of the reform are passed, then it would make these kinds of laws much easier to survive constitutional review. Without these reforms, I think it'd be quite likely that the Supreme Court would have struck down such norms if they were passed. So the reforms become a necessary basis for pushing forward these kinds of new rights theories.
I think it will be helpful for the audience, I mean, to understand why people are demonstrating in the street. I mean, a lot of what you've talked about is procedural issues, but people, I mean, the fact that, you know, thousands of women were wearing Handmaid's Tale, you know, costumes and walking through the streets of Tel Aviv, I think it will be helpful to understand what they feel threatened by, what's really motivating this. If you could talk about the kind of law, the substantive laws that we could see if this more procedural reform goes through.
Can I?
If you want to go, go.
So this is a very big question in Israeli society today. What is going on the streets? And there are, let's say, 3 or 4 competing narratives about this question. The historical, formal answer, the first narrative is that there were risks in the reform themselves. They are the first move toward Hungary, Poland, Venezuela, etc., and despite the fact the current, and as Ronen say, maybe each one we can live with, but not with all together. I am more extreme than Ronen in this issue. Few of them we can't live even if they were separately. So one version is that it is really about the governance issue. And then the debate is that on one end, people say, the right wing say, what are you talking about? There is no state like in Israel that the Supreme Court has so much power. And then the other side provide, there is no other state that is so unique like Israel's situation. So this is a formal, the formal answer. The opposite answer is of the right wing, which say, actually, you are not a real Democrat. Never ever you were able to let us really rule. In the past, Menachem Begin was a weak and took all the time partner from the left wing. Netanyahu in his previous model did the same. And now when we fully have a real right-wing government, you are not able to accept it because you are not really democratic. And you may protest against Netanyahu since the Ronen show, and this is now just excuse. So this is the opposite version. And I want to offer a in-between story. In my opinion, even in the beginning, it is not just about the governance issue, But as just Ori mentioned, what is glancing behind? It is the fact that all of this reform aim to enable to make all of those proposals in the issue of religion and state. So, and here, my theory is that in Israel, there was kind of unofficial agreement that says something like this. The rules are in some sense non-liberal. However, the legal system will be liberal, and in some way, in a practical way, it will enable the secular, the liberal somehow to live. For example, in the issue of marriage and divorce, which are my field, officially there is no civil marriage in Israel. However, you can get married in civil marriage, you can live together and get legal rights as cohabitant, and all of this did the court. Now, what the reform tried to do is to change these deals that somehow enable liberal and secular people in Israel to live. Because they say, we are now rule, and we are going to take you the only chance that you have. The Supreme Court that somehow will make your life reasonable in some such way. And this was one step that the liberal population in Israel could then take, and then all the shadows burst out.
So thank you. I don't want to dominate this conversation. I don't know if anybody from the audience wants to ask, or any of the panelists wants to add anything.
Suzanne, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, there's a question in the chat. There are a few questions in the chat, I think, that were put in there.
There was a question earlier which was answered, I think, by the panelists as they were speaking. So I don't.
Well, I'll ask a question that has to do with the day after in terms of scenarios that get spun about what happens, right, if legislation is passed that the Supreme Court rules is unconstitutional. Right? What then?
Maybe I'll go first now. Then we have constitutional chaos, which you will be surprised of the number of Israelis that are actually looking forward for this terrible moment. I belong to the risk-averse people who would think that we need to do almost everything to not getting there. But I know many people that say, yeah, let's go there. Let's see what happens. Especially because I think in the camp that resist the reform, there's a sentiment that the army, the police, the prosecution, that the people at the top of these organizations will obey the Supreme Court and not the government. So this is why they feel, I would not say confident, I would not say eager, but almost confident and almost eager to, to getting there. And the reason that my personal view is different is that I think we're in a moment where we can generate something new and better if we are smart enough to reach a widespread agreement, an agreement that will not be, my first best, but neither the other side's first best. But this second best agreement, I think, will be better than any of the alternatives, including the alternative where we get into this constitutional chaos and my camp wins. Okay, I think that even my camp, the camp that resists the the revolution wins, I think it will not be a good victory. It will be actually a terrible victory, because it will just open up a cycle of violence, so to speak, between us. So I'm not just afraid of Poland and Hungary. I'm also afraid of Lebanon and Syria. And we have examples in our neighborhood, the Middle East, of countries, of societies that were not smart enough to give up a little bit of their ideals in order to maintain civil structure. So I'm actually worried. I'm now shifting my energy since the legislation halted about a few weeks ago. I can't remember if it was 3 weeks ago. Before then, I was very supportive of the resistance. I actually, even in writing, supported civil disobedience, and also disobedience by a reservist in the army. I even supported that, which is, I think, unusual in this group. But once it's halted, I shifted my energies, and I'm no longer speaking those demonstrations, and I'm spending my time trying to see if I can help various groups reach widespread agreement. And so anyway, it's I'm actually worried, as I said, not just from Poland and Hungary, but also from Lebanon. And Lebanon is around the corner, literally and metaphorically around the corner.
No, it's very interesting when you're talking, Professor Lifshitz was talking earlier about how each side doesn't hear the other side. And I'm thinking this is not just an Israeli phenomenon. The same thing is happening here, basically. The political parties are basically unable to hear how people feel on the other side, what's making them make these decisions. So I wonder if it's not like an Israeli political moment, it's like more of a global political moment that's happening here.
Yeah, I think that, like a lot of things that happens in Israel, we're just a blip in the global map, right? So if you think about the heydays of human rights in the 1980s, that was Bill Clinton's global village days, right? So it was heydays for democracy and human rights all over the globe. And now there's a democratic backslide that happens in many countries, unfortunately. So yeah, I think we're part of global winds, but because we're a small country, a global wind is a storm for us. So I think we should be extremely careful. And of course, the reason that this is a global phenomenon, I think, a major reason is the echo chambers we all live in because of social network and, the way our news feed, the news feeds work. We just hear the news and the views that we like, and we don't hear the other side. So over time, we get more and more polarized, and that is actually a disaster. So one of the things that I'm involved in is trying to facilitate meetings between real people in real places, talking about real concerns in real language, not in social network language, which is very polarized and extreme. And I've been in several of those meetings. They're very good meetings. You come out very optimistic, but it's such a small scale that it's going to take centuries for everybody to meet with each other. So I don't know. I don't have a simple answer.
Right.
Can I just add a word on that? Just about the constitutional crisis scenario in case the court strikes down, say, a segment of this reform. So I'm on the sort of the camp that isn't as wary as Ronen from that scenario, but not for the reasons he mentioned. So that's what I wanted to interject. Not because I trust that the police or the military will sort of side with the court. Obviously, no one wants to go there. It's not that it's in a complete unlikelihood, so it could happen. But it would seem to me a far less likely scenario than the one many people predict, which is, say, the court strikes down some element. That's not the end of the story, as we know. The government can go back to the drawing table and draft a different bill that would be perhaps slightly less offensive to the relevant principle, and then pass it again. We've had those kinds of events happening in Israel before, in other countries as well, also in the constitutional level. And actually, to Ronen's point, going for a constitutional crisis in Israel is is exceedingly irrational for a government to do, right? Much more so than for a big kind of established country that has no other kind of economic or military risks, right? So if the government sort of decides, all out, kind of to openly defy a Supreme Court constitutional order and basically say, so kind of the scenario that's been playing out has been the government passes its new judicial appointment process. Supreme Court strikes it down, but then the Ministry of Justice still convenes the new committee and sort of pushes through new appointments. What do we do? What do we do there? I mean, that would cost a lot for Israeli economy, obviously, right? So this basically becomes immediately a failed state with no rule of law, where the government basically defies openly Supreme Court or constitutional orders of the Supreme Court. That's hugely costly for a kind of rational government to do, which makes you think that it's more of a kind of a threat than a kind of a likely scenario. It's not impossible, but seems much more reasonable that like what we had now. So we had this point of inflection when we had the firing of our defense minister. This came to something that felt like a constitutional crisis, right? Everyone was out on the street and no one exactly knew what's going on. And government backed down a little bit. And now we're sort of sitting again discussing a different kind of reform, and something will come out of that. And that to me sounds like a much more likely scenario than the all-out crisis.
Ori, let me just remind us that the Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, has publicly declared that he's not going to respect the Supreme Court ruling. What was the exact issue? I'm blinking.
Oh, that was about the convening of the Knesset a few years ago, but
No. I'm talking about 3 weeks ago.
Yes, he said that he will not nominate judges according to the current.
Yeah. It's about the most contentious point, the Justice's Appointment Committee, and he said he's not going to. The Minister of Justice said he's not going to respect the Supreme Court ruling. So I wish I could be as relaxed as you are.
No, it's easier said than done. Well, obviously, I mean, you want to play hardball until you have to make the decisions, right?
It is easier said than done, but it's also, I think, dramatic that a Minister of Justice publicly declares he's not gonna respect the Supreme Court rulings with respect to the most contentious portion of the reform. So I wish I could be as relaxed as you are, but maybe we should talk more. You can transfer to me a little bit of your coolness.
Well, it sounds like this will be continued when the Knesset meets again in a few weeks. So unless anyone wants to add anything, I just want to thank you all for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation. And I hope this conversation will have a happier ending if we reconvene a year from now to listen to what happens.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think the best thing that the American people can do is just stay in touch with what's going on in Israel. I think pressure that has been put on Biden has worked. Biden has, just by not inviting Netanyahu, has basically pressured him into a negotiation. And I think we, at least 2 out of the 3 of us here, maybe all 3 of us, agree that negotiations is the best thing that can happen these days. So Biden had a major role in pushing the prime minister into agreeing to negotiating by just not inviting him, as was traditionally done after a prime minister wins elections in Israel. A month or so later, he's invited to the White House. Biden has not done that, and has made it clear that until democracy is fully restored, with wide agreement, he's not going to invite him. And I think that was very helpful for both sides, by the way, for everyone who cares about reaching a widespread agreement.
Right, and I agree. And I think that was the reason really to hold this event, to have as many people as possible who realize what is happening, because it's very difficult. It's very easy not to pay attention with all the other things going on in the world at the same time.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guy, for moderating.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Guy.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Susie.